be. Okay, so the last couple weeks have been very active. The major achievement from the developer side is the release of the 2.2 OpenBazaar version, which was a major release. And there were two main components that made it a major release, two main features. First was the ability to buy and sell cryptocurrencies. And as of now, what that means is that vendors have a fourth listing type that they're able to add to the contracts, which is cryptocurrency. And then there's a list of cryptocurrencies they're able to pull from by pulling in price data from an API that they're able to sell at market price. And then someone else is able to send the funds that they accept, and they then manually fulfill the order because the buyer sends along the address they want to receive when they make the order. So that's the crypto listing feature, which has been much anticipated and took us a while to get out. But we view it more or less as a quick experiment to see how people use it and what people want from it in order to improve the functionality. And as a part of that, immediately after release, we have been collecting feedback from people using the product and from the community broadly to figure out what new features sort of need to go into that to make it even more useful to people. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. The other primary feature that was added in 2.2 was an opt-in analytics package. So people are able to share non-identifying data with the dev team. And this has been a long time coming. Now, of course, OpenBazaar, we care deeply about privacy. And so we've built this thing in a way that, it's completely decentralized. It's all end-to-end encrypted. People can use Tor if they want, right? Like, you should be able to guard your privacy as closely as you want on the platform. That has made development sometimes a little bit difficult because it's hard to know exactly how people are using the platform, and what needs they have. And you can only get so much information by asking people to just, volunteer it. And so we added a feature to allow opt-in analytics, and what you may have already seen is when you start the app, it just asks you, it gives you a screen and a modal, and it just lists all the things that are being collected, the information that would be collected, and then asks if you agree to opt in or disagree and opt out. Thus far, there have been, I think, more than 1,200 people over the past week and a half since we released it who have opted into stats gathering. Now, we don't know what proportion that is overall of the entire number of people using it, but based on downloads of the installer, based on some other proxies we have, how many nodes are active, we think it's probably a little bit less than a third of people using the platform have opted in over the past week and a half, which is actually not too bad, and we're already getting some interesting data and learning a few things by looking at that. So those are the primary features of the 2.2. There are a few other improvements that I don't think any of them and bug fixes are really that notable. Obviously, the release notes are out, so you can go view those at the GitHub if you want the details. So moving forward, the things that we're now beginning to focus on, one is, as I mentioned, gathering the feedback on the crypto listings feature and then figuring out where to go from here. One thing that we have heard from vendors is they want the ability to set their own market price, set their own price in general, not just be tied to the market price. And so we're looking into creating a markup feature so they can add a percentage on the top, or a discount as well. Actually, they can also at a discount below market price. Basically, we want to allow them to have a tool to not be pegged just to market price. So that is something we're now sort of figuring out the requirements of and figuring out how we're going to tackle that. And I can't remember, at this point, I think that's the only thing that we're going to change with crypto listings. Oh, other than, currently there are several dozen cryptocurrencies that people can choose from. I think there's something like between 40 and 60, I forget the number. And we are now working to integrate CoinMarketCap's price data. And with that, excuse me, the number should go from, a few dozen up to hundreds or even over 1,000. I forget how many are available through CoinMarketCap. So the number of crypto listings cryptocurrencies people will be able to buy and sell each other is will be immensely increased when that's done. So I think that's all the stuff we're looking at to add in the immediate future on the crypto listings feature. On the opt-in analytics side, we're still sort of looking and figuring out what information that we're getting and how it's useful, if there's something we need to change. Obviously with that, if anything does change, if we start collecting new data, then we're going to to display that to users as we did when people opt in initially speaking. The way that it's being captured, you sort of capture like specific events that happen. And so we're also going through and saying, what are some events that we're not capturing now that we want to capture to better understand what's going on? Okay, so moving forward, other than the crypto listings, really the big major focus that we're going to be looking at in the short to mid future is the OpenBazaar web client. And so you guys may already seen, excuse me, the OpenBazaar.com. If you haven't seen OpenBazaar.com yet, I recommend you go give it a look. That's a read-only web client for OpenBazaar. Basically, it hits the gateway nodes to pull information off the network, but you're able to browse it effectively the same way that you do in client, except obviously it's on the web. The next phase after that, by the way, we haven't really made a big push to start promoting the OpenBazaar.com site. We're making sure that it's free of bugs and whatnot before we do so. But it's looking pretty good now. I recommend you take a look. But the next step for that is what's called a buy-only web client, and as the name implies, that means people will be able to actually purchase things in the web client and not need to download the OpenBazaar client in order to buy stuff. So we've just sort of started the process of figuring out how that needs to be done. I don't know how much detail people want to go into to hear about that process or how much they'd like to be involved. But a big part of it was figuring out how far along IPFS.js is, their JavaScript implementation. And it seems like consensus is thus far that it's not far enough along for us to start building the buy only on top of right now. It's not sufficiently developed to do that. And so we're exploring what other alternatives need to be done to get to that point. So
have you guys expressed that to IPFS? They might be. I know they hold OpenBazaar in high regard, so they may be able to accommodate you.
I don't know the details of how much communication there's been between the team. In general, there have been open lines between those teams, but Brian or Mike or Josh, how much have we talked to them about how far along IPFS.js is?
As far as I know, probably pretty limited. I pinged them about it recently, just in regards to the DHT and the changes that they're making there. And they basically said that, they're putting more effort and emphasis on it. They want to fix it. I think where they're at, and I think I relayed this in a previous call, is that they have the DHT for the most part working on the JS side, but the two networks don't interoperate. The Go IPFS DHT as well as the JS. Like, they don't talk to each other at the moment. So that's kind of the next thing, is to make sure that they're all compliant. But I don't, they never give time frames. I mean, so it's hard to tell. They just track the issue on GitHub.
Yeah, and to bring it back to something we talked about earlier in the roadmap, this is basically like a 3-phase approach to doing the web client. The first is the read-only, which is more or less complete at this point. The second is the buy-only, and we, or at least I speak for myself, I had hoped that we could do buy-only by using IPFS.js, which is going to make it a bit more decentralized. But that's what's, I guess, still up in the air to some extent. But the third phase is to do like a full node in browser, and we haven't like sat down and talked about how that's going to work at this point. So I might be wrong in saying this, but I think that's almost certainly going to require IPFS.js or at least something similar. But that is definitely a somewhat out into the future kind of thing. And maybe by that point, when we're ready to do that, it's going to have developed, well enough that we can build on it. That's the hope anyway. That's my hope. Okay, well that's all that I had noted to mention from the OB1 side. I see there's several OB1 folks who joined the call since I started laying out the stuff. So if I've missed anything that we've done over the past few weeks or that we are now undertaking, please step in and let me know.
Well, for the people who just joined, they might not know what you didn't cover.
Right. That makes sense. Basically, I just covered what was in the 2.2 release, crypto listings and opt-in analytics. And then I talked about us focusing on improving crypto listings and on the starting work on the buyer-only web app.
Okay, great. Yeah, and obviously this is a development call. So if anybody on this call or anybody that you all on the call know is interested in getting to participate more in our web, our transition to building this thing on the web, please reach out. Let us know. There's a couple people that volunteered in the Slack, and we're trying to coordinate that a little bit better. But we would love to have help and feedback on the way we're thinking through that. I'm trying to make it so that some of the meetings that we have that maybe people aren't a participant in get their notes published onto the net, so you can catch up and contribute if there's a way. And Vic looks like he just asked. I'm assuming it's a guy. Might be a girl, whatever. Vic, has anyone explored using web components to build the web front end? We haven't gotten to a place yet exactly with what tech we're going to be building on. It's more of like we're trying to noodle through some of the more challenging aspects of making this a web app. For instance, client-side data storage, security, how to protect keys. Like we just started talking a little bit about the IPFS piece, stuff like that. We're trying to hammer out solutions to some of those ahead of time before we start actually building. But when we get to that conversation, I think we'll be looking at all the different options for how to implement that.
Yeah, hey, this is Chris Troutner. So everybody on the OB1 team knows me, but what some of you guys might not know is like I'm a JavaScript developer. That's what I do for a living and have for the last several years. So I would love to contribute as much as I can to. I'm very excited about the web implementation. I think that is, in my personal opinion, that is the way forward for you guys. And I would love to contribute anything I can towards that effort.
Yeah, I would love to get your help. Like I said, I mean, I think traditionally, and the reason why we even started kicking up these phone calls and stuff is, you know, we understand that this is a heavily OB1 driven project, and you know, basically the way that ended up happening is just that, like, look, we were losing people to token products and things like that, and we wanted to see this happen, so we just did it. But we're trying to branch out and get more people involved, and I think, you know, we're going to have more ways to incentivize people to help out, you know, in the future, and we just want to start. Yeah, any help is definitely warranted, or appreciated rather. So.
Yeah, and actually, this is something I don't know if I've mentioned on the dev call specifically. If everyone on the call has read through the roadmap or seen stuff we've talked about recently, you might already know this, but we are in the process of creating an OpenBazaar foundation whose goal is to, over time, transition the core protocol development away from OB1 and towards a foundation that'll have. The goal is to have sort of more community governance and whatnot. So, I mean, I'm biased, but I'd like to think OB1 has done a decent job of that over the past few years. But I think there's a lot that can be improved, and the creation of the foundation is meant to help with that process. So, if anyone's interested specifically in that side of it, contact me, because we're going through this process right now of trying to figure out how best to set this thing up.
Yep. I agree.
Okay, so I mean, I see some questions here and there in the chat, which is great. Does anyone have just sort of open the floor? Does anyone have thoughts, stuff that they're working on, questions about where we're going? Either on mic or in chat is fine.
This is Chris Troutner. I put some links in the general channel of the Slack channel, and there's been some discussion, mostly between me and Mike, about documentation schemes, and I realize, like, Mike's been very clear, you guys aren't willing to commit to anything right now, and I respect that. I just wanted to show what I'm doing with P2P VPS. I've got a couple different documentation schemes, and I'm sort of mimicking what I have picked up at the company I work for. They're using the same scheme, so just putting the information out there, showing what I'm doing, and suggesting it as a model that OpenBazaar could follow for maintaining documentation going forward.
Chris, I appreciate your involvement in the chat rooms, and I'd like to encourage more of that across our community. Regarding the point of the documentation, I do want to participate together in at least finding the right format for people to consume it, whether or not they even contribute to it. I think the consumption is probably the largest use case, and go from there. But this is going to be very much for benefit of those who have not been involved in our conversations. This is going to be a somewhat slow process during the course of this year. As the foundation forms, I expect that a lot of the technical assets that OB1 has been managing will have to reform in some way, shape, or size to be passed on to the foundation. So I'm thinking about that process in the meantime. So if you guys would like to be involved in that, participate in our chats, jump into our documentation channel, and pipe up, because there's lots of work that we can help with there.
I agree. Documentation is a huge weakness in this project right now. I mean, the code is the documentation for the most part. So, we're definitely going to be making a push to make that better.
In the chat, Vic asks if there's any plans to integrate logistics and other service providers in OpenBazaar so that the order payment is split between entities. I agree that would be really neat. That's something we talked about a long time ago. Is the fact that we do this through multisig allows us to do more complicated, both more complicated escrow in general, but also payouts. But it's something that there's never been a specific proposal for how to do that or exactly what the use case would be. So I think to answer the question, right now there's no plan to integrate sort of logistics and allowing for more complicated payouts. But I think it's a good idea, and I don't know if that's worthy of an OBIP right off the bat, OpenBazaar improvement proposal, or just like opening a GitHub issue and just getting ideas going on how that might work. Certainly an interesting idea.
Yeah, well, long term, we do have plans to add the ability to integrate various services with the platform, and this would be something open to anyone. We just haven't built those hooks in, so it's less a case of we would specifically add a shipping or logistics service. It's more that we'd eventually, add the hooks into the platform so that anyone could add whatever service they want. But that's a complicated thing, so we just haven't gotten to that part yet.
Yeah, we expect instead of putting value in the transaction between the buyer and the seller, we'd rather find auxiliary value that other federated providers can find ways to get payment out of, and opening those doors for those providers to themselves in our experience, like search, for example.
Yeah, I mean, Vic points out that he's trying to work on a recording contract to do this. There are other people on the call who understand our contract schema better than myself. I think it's definitely possible for it to be done in the contract itself and have the payout done through the multi-sig itself. But the question is, as what like Josh and Mike are pointing out, this could be done by adding in a service provider on the outside, and might not be done like directly at the protocol level either. So I don't know. This is why there needs to be a conversation on GitHub or Slack or somewhere to talk about which approach is best, because there's pros and cons to having it at the protocol level in the contract or having a service provider provide it, right? It can go both ways. Zardog asks if the reference client is currently limited to one item per contract. I think, okay, Mike is saying it supports more but expects only one. Yeah, thus far, it's only been implemented to expect one item, but it should be flexible enough to allow multiple. Because we've never attempted to sort of put that in the reference client, as far as I know, no one sort of tested the ability to do multiple items, but the flexibility should be there, because I know when we were building the 2.0 client, there was a question of whether or not we were going to put in like a shopping cart, because that is a commonly requested feature, and the complexity was substantial enough that we decided not to do that initially. But I believe the contract type supports it, if I understand it.
Yeah, currently it's possible to have multiple items in a contract. I believe from just a single vendor, but we have never really tested that, so I don't know what would happen if someone did it.
Yeah, to elaborate further, each of those merchants would probably need unique identifiers in our Ricardian contract, and our logic doesn't currently know how to reference those for paying purposes. And that's exactly the problem.
It's actually, I think it's just one, it has to be the same merchant for all the items.
I see. So we don't even allow multiple merchants to be allowed in the contract?
No, it's one merchant per contract.
Yeah, but that's the problem that you'd probably be running into, Vic, when working with your Ricardian contract. Adding additional parties there would have to be something that the entire protocol would be aware of, outside of the buyer, the vendor, and the moderator.
Right, yeah, but Zardog was asking about this, and I think he was talking about only a single merchant.
Yeah, so this is a problem that we run into because of shipping costs. It used to be the case that if you just went from, say, quantity 1 to quantity 2, the shipping price would double, which is obviously a bad experience. And we weren't able to sort of fix that by making it a shopping cart per se. So you're still not able to add one item from the same vendor and a second item from the same vendor. But we did change the shipping rules so that if you change the quantity, it doesn't. The vendor can set it so that it doesn't increase the shipping price. They can be sort of shipped at a flat rate. But yeah, I mean, we're talking about the way the Ricardian contract's set up right now. As Mike points out, they're still pretty rigid at the moment. There are certain expectations for how many users are involved in the transaction that right now that's kind of a hard limit unless we were to restructure how they work.
Yeah, I mean, if you had a transaction with 3 different merchants, I don't even know how you'd build it so that all 3 would have to agree that the transaction is complete to move the money.
Well, I mean,
weird stuff starts to happen at that
There may
point.
probably be multiple contracts.
Well, it understands multi-sig. So, I mean, if you're talking about the process of signing and whatnot, like that's already understood. It's just, it is complicated.
Right. Well, and just, I mean, from a user experience, you wouldn't want to have 3 merchants on a single transaction, and then the transaction gets stuck because one of them disappears.
Well, that was the issue with like refunds is if you do join on these contracts with multiple ones, and then you have a problem with one of them, how do you open a dispute on just that one? How do you, there's
right,
because if it has the data, that's specific to each party, you don't want to be sharing that data across all the different vendors. Like it's definitely a can of worms kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why we've kept it strictly to one party.
Yeah, Mike, we're currently, we have considered shopping carts. We have not implemented them yet because they add a lot of complexity to things. And I mean, it's a lot. It's one of those. Yeah, most e-commerce solutions have them. So it sounds like, well, why don't you guys do that? And that's because it's once you dig down into it, it's a very large project to add. That creates a lot of weird edge cases with how we do things. So we certainly still think we'll add them someday. We just haven't gotten to where that's a higher priority than other things.
You have to very literally think about the bazaar scenario. You're in the Middle East and you're in the bazaar and you walk up to a vendor and you buy something. Then you go up to the next vendor and you buy the next thing. Like you're not putting a whole bunch of things for various vendors and paying ones. Not that that's a good reason against that.
So one thing I thought I'd share, since this is a dev call, let me bring it up. One of the aspects, I developed this Node application that I'm calling the listing manager. I'm putting the link to the documentation in the chat right now. But this is it's a standalone Node application, the listing manager, and it automates. Sorry, I think the thumping was from me typing. I'll mute myself. Thanks for the feedback, Josh. But basically, it automates interactions with the OpenBazaar store and adding and removing listings on the store. And so I just thought I'd share that. It's kind of, if people want to set up a more sophisticated kind of OpenBazaar store where listings are getting created and destroyed based on some sort of other external input, like in my case, it's the expirations and people moving devices in and out of the P2P VPS network. So it's just kind of a good reference thing if people need a little more sophisticated or automated control of their OpenBazaar store. And it's open source, so feel free to fork the code.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Chris. This is really neat. I'm taking a look at it now.
If anyone else has interesting things that they're working on in the background, please feel free to share like Chris said.
Yeah, I'll just echo what Mike said. I mean, we love to hear, what folks are working on, new stuff, if they're having challenges. That's the point of these calls. So feel free to speak up or put it in the chat, or if you'd rather not on the call, just hit us up on Slack or whatnot.
Curiously, does anyone in this call do any hacking on the server side code? However, it's easy for you to.
Can you say that again, Mike?
Just wanted to do a quick poll to see who is actually hacking on the OpenBazaar server-side code for any reason. Wanted to know if anyone in the call was doing that.
I think I've submitted one pull request a few months ago, but Go's like, I have a lot of respect for the Go programming language, but I stay within my own field of expertise.
Is there anything about the OpenBazaar 1 code base that's interesting to you, Dave? Just out of curiosity. Ah, gotcha. Okay. Language affinity is as good a reason as any. Yeah, I'm maybe interested in more engagement, so just getting more points of data is helpful.
Yeah, I think that's why the API is so critical, because it transcends those language barriers.
Yeah, I agree. There's internal aspects of how our protocol works that need to be a lot more easy to access like an API does. I don't know that our HTTP API is the best way of interacting with our protocol. So getting more insight into what people are doing there is interesting to me.
Vic, you probably already understand this based on your investigation, and Josh just pointed it out as well. But OpenBazaar 1.0 is completely deprecated, and I mean, obviously, great taking a look at it, learn what you can, but it's fundamentally different from the 2.0, because it went from having our own sort of network to being based on IPFS, and I mean, there's similarities between the contracts. That there's definitely similarities there, but they're very, very different altogether. So, yeah, Bizarre Dog. I think saying there's a disconnect between the API docs and implementation is probably an understatement. And Brian pointed it out earlier that we know the documentation is effectively the code base at this point, which is bad. So that's something that we've been talking a lot about more recently, how to address that. And Chris Troutner has been making good suggestions, and we're trying to figure out the best way to get that updated so that that problem doesn't remain.
There's in my experience with the API docs, it's at least with 2.0, because that's what the API docs focus on, is they're slightly out of date, but they're still pretty damn useful. I mean, they're a lot better than nothing. And but there is my understanding is there's like pretty big chunks of stuff that are missing, like some of the newer stuff that's been developed in the last 6 months.
Yeah, and there has been pretty rapid development since the 2.0 was released, obviously, which is great for users and great for the platform itself, but not great for people building on it if we don't update them, which they haven't been properly. So, but definitely check them out. They're not, as Chris points out, they're still useful, and they still give you the gist of what's happening. Just any given call might not be exactly where it is today. Okay, are there other thoughts or questions from folks before we wrap this call up?
Nope.
All right, well, I'm not hearing anything, so as always, thank you everyone for joining. Appreciate it. As I mentioned, this call has been recorded. It'll be on the OpenBazaar channel. And please, if you have any questions or thoughts, or you want to contribute or help out, reach out to us on Slack. We'd love to hear from you, and we'll hopefully see you all in a couple weeks.